Good evening. I call this meeting to order. Our Councilor Bellamy and Councilor Signer will join us within the maybe half hour or so.
Next 10, hopefully 15 minutes, yeah.
So we can get started.
Great. Thank you. If everyone who is on the HAC, if they could please stick an arm in the air. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you very much. If there is no objection, I would like to declare a quorum. No objection being heard. The HAC is now in session. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is the Housing Advisory Committee's City Council first of 6 housing work sessions for 2019. Up on the screen, you will see it says work session number 2. That is because technically we are following on from our work session at the end of August. I am the people up at the table here, in addition to the councilors, include members of the HAC's policy subcommittee, and perhaps a quick introduction might be in order. I'm Phil Duranzio. I am the chair of the HAC and the banker rep.
I'm Dan Rosenzweig. I'm the co-chair of the policy subcommittee and representative of Habitat for Humanity Greater Charlottesville.
Sunshine Mathon, Piedmont Housing Alliance.
I'm Rich Schuyler, the Dean of Community Self-Sufficiency Programs at Piedmont Virginia Community College, and I am the co-chair of the Policy Subcommittee.
Lyle Soliates, Vice Chair of the HAC, City Planning Commissioner Representative.
Thank you. So to move sort of very quickly, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to how we got here before diving in. We are following on the August 30 housing joint HAC City Council housing session, which was the first dive that sort of in a sort of policy way into the housing needs assessment provided earlier that year. And sort of one of the outcomes on that, from that meeting was coming to grips with some of the costs at addressing affordable housing in a meaningful way under any sort of reasonable timetable in the city of Charlottesville. And the consensus was that it was hard to escape that this really was a 9-figure problem. And we have since come to start to grapple with that. And the purpose of this meeting is to take a closer look at what that means and how we can apply those funds and in what ways. So one of those next steps at the time that of the meeting back in August was to move forward with a housing strategy. The council did provide funding for housing strategy development and in October, and also agreed that further sessions like this one would be useful. We met the policy subcommittee in driving this in October to look at what those sessions would look like. We had a variety of topics and had started to organize them with look to council to say, these are the things we think we ought to talk about as we develop the strategy. And even as we started to send that question out for feedback, as often happens, as John Lennon said, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. Events overtook us, and it became clear as towards the end of the fall that there were needs and commitments that needed to be made by the city that were substantial in the 7-figure range that council needed to start making decisions about today, now. And in that, so to address that, we sort of inverted some of the order. We were initially going to be looking at what does our housing stock look like? What are the zoning issues that? What are the land use? But we inverted the order of some of these sessions and said we really need to come up with a financial framework to at least begin to have that conversation. So that is the purpose of this meeting, and towards that end, we're going to show to council, and at council's request, or a couple of council's members' request, a tool that takes into account a lot of the moving parts and how city funding impacts all of that. So, and by a tool, I mean this is not a policy, this is not a strategy. This is a set of, a piece of equipment that we hope is helpful to make preliminary priorities clear, to show impact of how we spend money and where, and it is also designed to be flexible, to change and to adapt to the strategy, to keep a running total, as it were, of how money is being spent and where we are in the process, and tie it in to developing units and interventions in affordable housing. As Sunshine will pick up, to review some of the numbers from the study, we are looking at developing what amounts to 4,000 units, but we don't really mean units. We mean interventions, creating affordability in 4,000 situations. It's not building 4,000 houses. And all of those have their own complexity. So that is, that's why we're here. We want to walk through it. We want to show you what we think it can do. We want to solicit advice and feedback and take a deeper look at it as again, the first of several, so that as we start making these decisions in the next few weeks, we can come to grips with a plan to move forward. And with that, I'll let Sunshine sort of show you define the problem.
Good evening. I realize I'm talking this way, and these microphones are not amplified, so if for some reason anyone in the audience can't hear me, please let me know. So just quickly to talk about some of what Phil referenced. The quote above, as well as the graph here, the spreadsheet here as well, are both from the housing needs assessment that was issued last year. And it breaks down, as best it can, the number of rental housing needs in the city, both in the current snapshot of 2017 as well as future projections to 2040. One of the nuances that has missed a lot of people's attention to some extent, including myself initially, this paragraph is in the executive summary, and I'll just read it out loud quickly, which just says, the city's affordable housing needs are defined to equal the number of cost-burdened renter households spending more than 30% of their housing income for housing, but most urgently, those with severe cost burden spending more than 50% of their income for housing, replacement of existing assisted housing units in poor condition, and housing needed to accommodate homeless individuals and families. The point of reading that statement is that it's clear that in the current snapshot of 2017, we don't have 3,318 families on the street. We don't have that homeless situation. But what we have is a significant number of folks who are paying far more than they should be for their housing. And one way to address that is one critical tool, and a tool that we absolutely need to deploy, is building new affordable housing. There's no question about that. However, there are other means by which to begin to address this issue beyond just the building of housing. So as a simple example, although we're not going to get into that in this conversation, if we could raise people's incomes and they could start to afford where they currently live because their incomes go up, that's another way of actually addressing our affordability gap. So personally, I've come to describe this not as a 3,318 unit housing gap, but an affordability gap. Just to be clear, there's absolutely need for new units, and in particular, replacement units that we all know for both public housing and Friendship Court. But and there is absolutely a need for some units, obviously for folks who are facing homelessness, and maybe some folks who are doubled up in their conditions, living with families and that sort of thing. But there are other interventions, and you will see that as we get more into this, that we're proposing as ways to think about how to address that affordability gap that go beyond just simply new housing.
So Sunshine, I'm going to pause you there. Folks who are sitting over here probably won't be able to see the screen, so if y'all want to roll chairs over to the space that's over there so you can see, now would be a good time to do it. It may not be possible. Should I have thought of this before? Now that we're all seated, all right. Are you guys good, or? Look at this. Rolling, rolling, rolling.
Oh my God.
Look at that.
Rawhide.
That's right.
Gosh.
Is everybody as situated as they want to be? All right. Thanks.
Rich, thank you. So the other really important point to make in this discussion is around what does area median income mean, and is it the right measurement tool for measuring our affordability gap? So there are two charts up here. One, the top one is from the housing needs assessment, and is reflected in that document because it was the snapshot that we had at the time, which was 2017 information. And so everything that is referenced in the housing needs assessment references that point in time as far as the incomes. And so just to be clear, you see a breakdown, and this is also the way that the housing needs assessment was organized. So as we get into the tool, the tool is reflective of that housing needs assessment framework, because that's the easiest way for us to measure back and forth. So, for example, in the housing world, I probably would have chosen to have a separate row for 40% AMI, because we typically have some units of that category. That's not the way the housing needs assessment was organized. So that's not the way the tool is currently organized. You'll see that shortly. But we're trying to have some parity and reflection so we can track what's there versus what we're intervening and doing. So as a quick example, somebody who is considered extremely low income, which means 30% of the area median income or less, for a single person household, that is about $16,000 a year, all the way up to a 4-person household, which is about $23,000 a year. This is again 2017 data. And the reason that I wanted to highlight the number of persons in the household, because the number that is used currently, and if we go to 2018 data, the number that is used currently in the city, which is 89,600, I believe, is an average family size, but 100% AMI, which is 89,600 in the city of Charlottesville, is for an average family size, but that will vary by household size. So somebody who's a single person household, on average, the area median income is lower than it is for a multi-person household. So unless you are clear on that, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing when you're looking at the data. So I just want to make sure we're all consistent on that.
And then just before we leave this chart, it's just interesting to note that a person working full-time at minimum wage makes $14,400 a year. So that's not even enough to support one person, much less a single head of household trying to raise a family. So, and again, just for translation purposes, if you make $15 an hour, you roughly make $30,000 a year. So we're struggling to get people to $15 an hour, but you would see that would get a 2-person household to a very low income status.
So this graph, representing that sometimes people can more easily relate to graphics than numbers on a chart. This graph represents that same breakdown that we saw on the first slide. Can you just go back 2 slides quickly, Ridge? So this chart here, when you look at the 2017, and this is reflecting the 2017 rental needs assessment. So if you look on the far right-hand side, you can see that there's a need for 1,738 total interventions, although it's labeled units, total interventions, affordability interventions for folks at 30% or below of the area median income. So if you go back to the chart, you'll see that number reflected there. So this is just a graphic of that representation. So you can see that slightly more than half of the housing needs assessment identified needs are for folks at 30% AMI and below. A significant chunk, more than a quarter, are for at 30 to 50% AMI. A smaller chunk, but still significant, at 50 to 80%, and then there's still a chunk at 80 to 100% as defined by the housing needs assessment. And then this two sets of two charts, actually, if you added them together, represent the previous chart. But we wanted to pull them apart for a second because it's important to recognize that, and this is going to become clear when we get into the tool, talking about the tool. The tool itself starts to break apart those units that are needed for replacement units, i.e. public housing and Friendship Court, versus other types of interventions, which includes new units, just completely new units, in addition to other ways of addressing that affordability gap for families. So if you look at this, you can see that, and they're scaled to some extent to represent the numbers. So if you're just starting on the right-hand side, all of the replacement units represent blue, which is that 30% and below set of families, 30% below AMI set of families. For the other outside of replacement units, we're talking about new units plus other interventions, you can see there's still a very significant chunk for below 30% families. But the weight of it, how important that is relative to the others starts to even out a little bit relative to the previous diagram. So it's just a reference point, just so people have that conception in their mind as we move into the conversation.
Does that make sense to
Oh,
everybody?
yes, that's good. This is really good.
All right. So my kids would laugh at the fact that I'm driving this technology train, history major. I'm still on MySpace. But what I thought we would do is, these are elements of the spreadsheet that we'll show in a minute, but it's a little bit easier to see on this. These are the housing interventions that are what Sunshine was referencing. This is, as Phil said, just our first run at what this looks like, trying to put some context. When we talk about 4,000 units, and what do we need to do to address that affordability gap, we're starting to flesh out, and we're really at the very beginning of that development of the housing strategy, but this is kind of where we're starting. These are the ideas that we've heard so far, and then we've taken those and priced them out. These are the interventions that require some amount of funding. This spreadsheet does not include interventions that might fall in the policy realm outside of funding needs. So if you think about rezonings and reducing lot sizes or making it cheaper to build housing, that's not captured here, but it will be captured in the housing strategy as we move forward. So just, that's a caveat. So we'll start with this, and while I'm driving the train, I shouldn't be the only one talking, and I've been told at the beginning that I talk too much, so I'm bearing that in mind. But you'll see the three different kind of levels. The top is what Sunshine was just talking about. These are the replacement units for the substandard housing that needs improvement. Next is the list of new housing units and the various ways we think right today that new housing units might be created, and and you'll see what kind of funding we think might be needed in order to spur that along. And at the bottom are additional housing interventions that don't involve building new units, but do help get families into housing that they can afford. And so I thought we might want to just pause there and say, okay, that's what we have so far. That list will grow and change, and things will be deleted as we start learning more and doing more research and hearing more from the community about what interventions they would like to see. But just to get some frame of reference, this is kind of our starting point.
And I'd like to just clarify a couple of those acronyms. So moving down to the new unit category, you'll see, for example, between replacement and new units, you'll see that CRHA is represented twice, Friendship Court is represented twice, because in both cases we're talking about replacing units plus adding new additional units. And then further down, you'll see what a category under new housing units called LIHTC rentals. And what that means is other projects that would utilize other rental projects that would use low-income housing tax credits, which are not currently known and not associated with public housing or Friendship Court, but other potential LIHTC funded projects to go somewhere in the city. SRO and PSH. SRO stands for single room occupancy. PSH stands for permanent supportive housing. Essentially what that is referring to is like a crossings version 2. A property that's designed specifically for folks who are homeless or on the verge of homelessness and need a place to stay and often have virtually no incomes.
And I see I misspelled an acronym already, so that's kind of sad. So I'll let the Vice Mayor sit before we go on. So then we looked at these housing interventions and then tried to calculate of the need that was identified, and we're looking at the roughly 4,020 need that we'll need over the course of the time period that was listed in the housing needs assessment. We've looked at what would these interventions cover to get to the number that we're looking at. So you'll see we need, 376 CRHA replacement units, 150 Friendship Court. I mean, you can read it for yourselves. But this is our first stab at looking at the interventions and saying, all right, based on what we know today, how many people would be affected by those interventions to meet the goal that has been identified in the housing needs assessment?
Add a little bit of texture to that. So again, I want to really be careful in stating that this is not a plan. This is an initial stab at getting to 4,000 unit / interventions. It wasn't done just by throwing spaghetti on a wall. So a lot of it was, some of these things are known knowns. So for example, below the first blue ribbon, we know that we need at least a 1-to-1 replacement of CRHA units, and we know that we need to replace Friendship Court units 1-to-1. So those numbers, the 376 and the 150, those are pretty fixed. Then you get to the other units. So for example, the CRHA additional units, that was working with CRHA leadership and FAR to talk about how many units, at what kind of scale could CRHA take on the administration of and maintenance of more units. And given the vacant land, that assumption was that that would utilize the extra land or the vacant land on CRHA properties. So there's something real behind that number. Some other numbers have to do with working with some of the housing providers to see what their capacity is. Some of it has to do with looking at the amount of leverage that would be required. So for example, the SROs and PSH units, we worked with TJAC, and Anthony Harrow from TJAC felt like we needed, right now, we have a need for about 50 SRO units at below 30% of area median income, and then we need a next step as well, between 30 and 50, so that people have a place to transition into. So these numbers weren't just spaghetti on a wall. They were based on yield analyses, data, polling, practitioners, but it's also fungible. This is because this is something that ultimately council is going to have to decide. Some of those numbers are fixed and some of them are a lot more loose.
Those unit assumptions for both CRHA and Friendship Court, so those are all affordable units.
Yeah, although I'm recognizing
I'm
that
just
that
asking.
what's represented under new housing for Friendship Court is not accurate because that includes some of the market rate units. There's a mistake there.
Right, and right
Yeah,
now
in the actual tool that we're going to show, the numbers are more accurate.
Okay.
It just misrepresentation is
And
not
similarly
accurate.
for CRHA units, right now we're looking at the 376 a replacement, 261 additional affordable units, but it doesn't account for any additional units that may not be affordable.
Correct.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Well, as a point of clarification, the pie chart does show 80 to 100% of AMI, which would not be considered affordable under a typical definition. I'm guessing that
That's true.
everything that's being built at Friendship Court falls below 100% AMI.
And so have you all talked about defining for our area what is priority?
So
And another question, is there a staff member currently? Because Stacy was working on this. Okay.
So I guess the answer to your question is that the priorities are really to grow out of the strategy and then how council wants to implement it. What we're trying to do is just put some number flesh on what the costs of implementing any given thing in any given direction might be, and how to and what priorities might mean based on what we think we know about costs today. And one of the flexibilities, as you'll see as we move forward, is that we can adjust assumptions pretty finely to figure out what's next and what's next, as it were. So
I would add just one thing to that to answer the Mayor's question is that there were certain things that were sort of fixed in putting together this initial projection. One is that we needed to get to at least the right amount of 30% and below of affordable units. So we tried to tweak the interventions somewhat so that the interventions matched up as well as possible with what was identified as the need. We didn't quite get there, but that was the attempt.
right.
And Ridge, you mentioned that it did not the assumptions around zoning changes aren't in here, but you do have ADUs in there, so there's some assumption based on that.
Right. And the reason that they're in there is because, as you'll see on the spreadsheet, the thought was in order to spur the creation of ADUs, it requires both a policy change that would allow them, but maybe some incentive to get people to build them. So it was thrown on here because there was some cost involved with it. There may be other strategies that don't involve a cost.
And to be clear, ADUs is referencing accessory dwelling units on the chart, just to not have acronyms.
Sorry.
I'm sure this is just my lack of knowledge, but and I think I so appreciate this just the effort as it is right now. It's so helpful to see in one place goals. It's just incredibly helpful to see it at this level. So when we are negotiating, like with an SUP for a certain number of units, and there's a range in that negotiation, so 10 years, 15 years, the different, and you've seen some of that on the dais, like with the West Second or different things like that. Where does that fall in here? And then my second question, is that low income, is that LIHTC? Because we're assuming that those landlords would use those credits, or is that another category? And the second thing is those expire, right? I mean, that they have a durations. They go 10 years or 15 years. My question would be, as this would be implemented, it would at least give us standards to say, here, we've filled out this piece of the pie, but then in 15 years, this would, they have a duration, right? So what's the city, how does that fit into a 15-year strategy?
That's an excellent question, and that's actually, as you asked that question, that's not, as we get further into the spreadsheet, you're going to see a series of multiple columns that represent a bunch of different data. Okay. That's not one data point we currently have, although I think it's a valuable piece of data, and I don't quite know how we think it through, but there's value in thinking it through, so it's an important question. As it relates to LIHTC specifically, if you're talking about, say, a West Second or a dairy building, the units that are used there are not using LIHTC.
They're not.
So no. So any agreement as it relates to maintaining affordability over the long term has to be driven by the city. Because in LIHTC, one last thing. Under LIHTC, there is a 15-year requirement, but then there's also an additional 15-year compliance period. So there's actually a 30-year arc of affordability requirement when you introduce LIHTC. And then there's an additional bifurcation that happens, which essentially is that every LIHTC deal essentially has to have a nonprofit either at the lead or as having a right of first refusal,
right. Okay.
Because no one wants to see that affordability disappear. Maybe if it's a market rate developer, a for-profit developer, they might in some level. But the goal is, ultimately the goal of the subsidy, the LIHTC subsidy, is to maintain affordability as long as possible. So there's a 30-year requirement, but there's also a tool built in. So ideally the nonprofit who has a mission to maintain affordability in perpetuity has the opportunity to grab that property before it leaves. It doesn't always happen, but that's the goal. In the case of a nonprofit lead organization, like in the case of Friendship Court or whatever, there's another level of certainty because it's nonprofit driven.
So where would the dairy units fall in?
None.
They're not shown in here currently. That's
So that's
But Carlton Views would.
Carlton's used wood because it is LIHTC.
And again,
Right.
this was our,
So
this was our first swing at a series of, not to get lost, this is not an exclusive bucket, it's not an exhaustive bucket. We put together a bucket, and now we're trying to, and now we want to be able to demonstrate and get some sense of filling what bucket with what and how much, and how that changes the financial picture over time.
And the
and
only reason I'm
cost.
pushing on that point is because as we go into the discussion about funding, using leverage, which basically means getting a lot more mileage out of $1 put toward affordable housing, is going to be a huge topic for the city. And when we can use, like, we have an enormous amount of leverage with SUPs because we basically don't grant them unless they agree, and that's a negotiation. So that it's the opposite of like the city financing and building a building, which where you have, and running it and so on. So like, and it might be that maybe, but looking
Watch
even at
the
the
space.
dollars at the amount of,
But
okay,
I
great.
just wanted to
Watch the
say that
space.
one of the things that Stacy Pathia shared with me before she left was that over the last 10 years, the amount of money that was brought in with the SUP essentially only built 67 units.
So-
Because it's so small amount of money that brings in through an SUP.
And one last point is that it's not uncommon for cities that have SUPs or other density bonus programs or structures like that to require affordability periods that are similar to LIHTC, i.e. 30 plus years. That's not uncommon.
And that can be baked into a policy or strategy cake. But for our purposes here, we're really talking about cost over time. And leverage becomes a very large part of the next piece of the tool, so.
But I think you raise a really good point, and I think if the tool is to be truly useful to council and whatnot, seeing the trade-off, if you say, man, if I could squeeze 20 units out of that SUP, it means that I don't have to fund 20 units that's going to cost us, $55,000 in leverage per unit. And so you can start to see how those things kind of fit together.
Right.
But because that doesn't cost the city any money, it's a kind of a policy. It isn't in here yet, but I could see where it would be useful to have it.
Can you say how or why this precedes the housing strategy?
Sure. By necessity, in that right now, today, we are facing some fairly large financial commitments. And the purpose of this tool is to be available as the strategy is developed and to change, to adapt. It is designed to be extremely adaptable and to move, to adjust to the strategy as we go to get a sense of long-term costs, present value of money versus money, cost over time. So it's not designed to, it is not a policy, it is not a strategy, it is a device to help get a handle on money and the relationship between units and outcomes that can be driven by the strategy. The strategy can then drive. So, but we realized that we were facing those commitments today, now, and the strategy isn't here now. And as funding requests come up, for whatever sum they are, it's useful to have a sense of what does this mean as compared to doing this or this, based on the information we have right now today. As the information and data changes, so do the inputs into the tool, so do the outcomes and the money. So it's designed to be a viewfinder, a spotlighter, and a check on costs over a long period of time.
Does presuppose a significant amount of information, and how does it influence at all what the potential need is in the housing strategy, and whether we need a consultant to do it versus the HAC or another group?
Right. And I think at that point would be sort of next slide. Or, yeah. So,
I'm going to go to the next slide. I don't know if it's going to answer your question,
but
so
we can get
I'm-
started. I
We're
mean,
going
there's
to start
more
showing
coming.
the tool.
And some of this may answer, some of these questions may become clearer. So this is
So-
what you just looked at. All right, go ahead.
So this is the tool. So all of these columns that you see here are what was on that previous page with their numbers. We and maybe to answer Mike's question a little bit is, as the HAC starts thinking about the strategy, now that we know what the needs are and we start thinking about, all right, how do you fill those needs? We kind of internally thought, well, we need some kind of way to gauge and put some kind of context around what it's going to cost, just for us as we are starting to explore strategies. And then, it became clear to us that council was being asked to make funding decisions before the strategy is done, and we kind of, and so we thought, well, why not share what we are starting to put together for ourselves with council, just so they can have the same context that we have as we're starting to develop this thing. That's where this began. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
So, why don't you
Okay.
open up the next one?
So,
I think we might disagree about it, so it's okay.
So one of the things that Joy and Anthony and others said is we'd like to look not just at the total number of interventions or I think of families served, but at what levels of affordability. And so part of the tool is to look at those levels of affordability. So each one of these interventions we have taken a stab at looking at who would these interventions help in terms of those income categories. And so I'm just going to open them all up so that you can see kind of, again, just our current thinking about what that might look like. And these are all the ones in yellow, can be manipulated, and you're watching me painfully use the technology. So these are the assumptions that we started with about who these interventions or units would serve. So that's our starting point. We then looked at...
But those are based on the percentages from the PES, right?
Right,
And
so
then
we've tried to match up what here's what the needs assessment said at the various levels of income. And then we try to map and say, well, what interventions we're starting to think about would address those income levels, and then put them on a spreadsheet and start to just get some kind of context around them. And so this was our, again, first run at that, very preliminary, but you see both the number of, the number of units that we thought would meet at those income levels. And then you can see, what we were assuming in terms of size and cost per square foot and the unit cost, what it would cost to build all of those units at that cost, and then how much leverage at this point we think would be required of the city to produce that unit. So the way to look at that is to produce a unit at less than 30% AMI for CRHA would cost the city would be asked to throw into the kitty $45,000 per unit to cover the cost of a $135,000 unit. So the unit costs $135,000. In order to make those numbers work, this says the city would throw in $45,000 per unit into that mix.
And to be clear, before we get too much in the details, those numbers that are shown up there are pure estimates. We don't know, for example, what the average unit size is necessarily. We don't know yet what the cost per square foot is. We're making just broad brush assumptions because we don't have the real data yet. But they're close.
But as we do, they would get plugged in.
Well, it's a little bit more than just, I don't want to characterize it as a guess. So the CRHA replacement units, for example, take the inventory that exists now and takes the average square footage of those. The cost per square feet is a general WAG based on current building costs.
True.
In some cases, there's land in there. Some cases, there's not. So there's data behind it, but that data will evolve over time.
So the difference between capital and operating costs, this is about the cost of
The capital cost.
build the
Capital
building.
spend.
So what about What about, so how do you deal
So-
with the,
so the point-
with the yearly operating costs
The
for the
purpose
apartment
of
building or
that
for-
subsidy at the front end is to make it so that the operating costs are sustainable with the rental income, even though it's low, to sustain itself over the long term. Plus, in the case of, so if we're talking about the top tiered units, those units get additional federal subsidy. You know, the HUD subsidizes public housing to cover the delta between what the residents can pay and what it costs to operate. So, but the way that the allowable debt to get there, the only way to get there is with subsidy directly from the city, so that the debt that they have to take out is small, so it can be supported by the low rent plus the subsidy from HUD. And in Friendship Court's case, it's a Section 8 subsidy, also from HUD, a different flavor of it. But it's the same basic idea. The point of that subsidy, both the LIHTC portion of it and the city portion of it, is to have the pro forma ultimately so that the property can sustain itself over the long run without additional intervention. That's the goal.
And so I have a quick comment. Could you scroll down a
Sure.
bit?
I think I can.
Okay. So I think, some of, the numbers that are on here, I think it's important, why it's important for us to have the conversation about priorities first, and how long affordable housing wasn't a priority. And so, before you start throwing in that there are needs at every income level, there have been decades and longer that the focus has only been on higher income levels. And so the conversation around the priority that we are going to, before you all start putting stuff together that's going to imprint and that you all expect to, be kind of the defining roadmap, because I look at this and it's hard. I mean, I know you all are saying, oh, we just wanted, to start the conversation, but these things have a way of sticking.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and maybe this is getting at Mike's point. I mean, throwing up something like this has its risks, because
Yes.
people see something on paper and they're like, oh, the city is going to pay all this money for all these housing, and we're going to produce all these units over 15 years. But as we develop a housing strategy to meet the need, it was kind of, we had to start, so I think as we unfold a strategy and have more work sessions, there are lots of elements of this, which is just a framework of funding. It's not a prioritization, it's nothing like that. We can start bearing down on some of these really important issues, like, okay, we don't have this amount of money right now, so which things do we choose first? And do we push harder on SUPs to meet some other band of affordability that, but I think we could do that as we start unfolding the strategy. But, so the other thing that this does not capture, because we just don't know enough yet, is when it says leverage needed per unit, we haven't even begun a in-depth discussion about what other funding sources besides these known ones are out there. So we know kind of what LIHTC does and what non-LIHTC funding needs to be brought to bear. We've assigned all the rest of that to this leverage needed per unit, as if the city were going to come up with it. But maybe as we start developing a strategy, we say, wait a minute, there's this source of funding that nobody ever thought of that could fill that bucket. We just aren't there yet, but that's how we would as a community fund these housing needs is part of what the strategy will help us determine. But we wanted to figure out, well, what is the nut we're trying to crack, and then start bearing down on how do we help pay for that beyond just taxpayer dollars. So it's a starting point.
I think it's an important point too, and that's something that I know when I came back to you guys in December, because there was some energy around council, just making sure, how do we ensure that we are evaluating every possible source of funding, because these are significant numbers that we are going to be going to our community for.
Yeah.
And not just sources of funding, motivation, especially how the HAC is designed overall and who sits on it. That's been a concern of mine the entire time, which is why I want to make sure that we have at least staff there, but just the motivation behind the presentations that we get.
Yeah.
But again, from my brain, those units that you've identified by income, by AMI category, that need was identified by the PES study and affirmed by your, like Anthony with the SRO.
Right.
Those numbers weren't just pulled out of the hat.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a back and forth where we try to put in what we know, which is what the needs are, for example, just replacement units, plus what we think we know about plans in the short term, plus a little bit of dose of trying to see what's potentially achievable from additional LIHTC allocations we might be eligible for, you know,
But
in the
if
city.
we add up all that 30% and below,
Right.
does that add up to the number of half of 4,000?
So I'm
Is
gonna
that
flip,
2,000 units?
I'm gonna flip over to the
That's what
summary.
need was.
I'm gonna flip over to the summary, and you'll see that it's 2,217
Okay,
units. So 54% of the units that are in this particular framework, just this snapshot today, 54% of the interventions are focused on this band.
That's helpful. That-
You know, so
Okay, good,
And
thank you.
it is broken down in the gaps analysis, so these numbers actually, at 30% below, they significantly exceed what the gaps analysis said is necessary. But again, this is all fungible because it's not policy, it's just a tool.
Yeah.
But
So, I mean, we can move all of these numbers around, and I think maybe the next sort of expansion might sort of be helpful there.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Dan? And go back to the chart you were just on, Rich?
this one over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you exceeded the less than 30% area median income that's the today figure by almost 600?
This is a 15-year run.
Right, so this is tackling the 4,020, 2040.
Even that was only 1950. So what's the rationale for exceeding the 2040 projection by 260 plus units?
it was, we tried to get as close to the ratio, we tried to tweak the numbers a little bit to get as close to the ratios that the gap analysis said we needed. They didn't quite get exactly there.
Yeah.
Got about as close as, without sort of making policy, we got about as close
But
as we
even
could.
as Mr. Murphy just stated, it's still nearly 250 some odd units more, which would have a significant cost that, according to this data, the city would have to incur. So, I mean, I'm assuming, I mean, we were there when we were making this together, so I'm assuming that can be adjusted.
Right.
It means this is a live, active spreadsheet
Right.
that we
So-
can adjust on the fly, and you
Right.
say what priorities we want to focus on, we adjust it on the fly, and all of these are just for like not, I don't want to characterize it as scattershot, it's not scattershot, it's just kind of like a first pass at sort of what would it take.
No, I got you
with that,
wholeheartedly.
and then we need feedback from y'all.
I think-
What are the right priorities we should be looking at? Is there anything on this list
That
of
needs to be
interventions
changed.
that we have
Yeah.
not considered that we should be considering?
No, I understand wholeheartedly. I mean, in fact, I think there's an argument to be made that the number should, to a certain extent, remain where it is, because we could anticipate more people who may be coming into the city, or for whatever reasons, whether that's income or whatever, we may in fact still need those units. I think, just as Mr. Murphy was saying, we just need the justification
We know that less
for us
than
to be able to say
30
that.
creates the greatest need for subsidy, right? And you're going more than 10% beyond what the 20-plus year projection is on that. And I think that, you know, we need to know why that would be. And,
Well,
you know,
well, largely that's a matter of of presentation. I mean, that's very easily adjustable. It's just that as we're presenting it now with the known knowns we have, well, maybe we need to adjust leverage down here and move the numbers a bit.
with great respect, and I'll govern my comment as
Right.
nicely as I can, right? You all made some comments that were pretty insulting last week, right? Talking about the staff way of doing business. And I don't find this to be that much more helpful or scientific. And so I think that there is some bias in the way that it's created. That's just the facts. I also have great concerns that if, I know all the work that goes into the Friendship Court numbers to get them to a sustainability plan so that they can operate all the units and pay for them. I have no idea in the world how it can be possible to sustain operations in CRHA by only adding 261 units that are all 50% and below. I mean, this is something I'm talking with Joy a lot about, right? I've talked with Grant about this. We've had multiple discussions about it. I'm looking for the number so that council can understand what their investment will buy. But in the end, it's not about the replication of 376 units. And so, to me, at minimum, believing that at one point we thought there needed to be 640 or 4-to-1, right, at Friendship Court, and somehow, which I thought was rabbit out of the hat magic, like incredible work, that they got that down to 3-to-1, right? That means at minimum, we're talking about 1,128 total units managed by the Housing Authority. How is it only 638 and they're all below 50% here? I don't understand the math behind that at all.
I think, well,
I'm sorry, was there, I think there was a question, was there a question about the math about the CRHA units, or?
I have questions about why there's more 30% units than is in a 20-plus year projection, and why are the additional CRHA units only 261, and why are they all under 50%?
well,
So
we can
the
change.
261 came from CRHA and FAR, and it was based on the number of units that they felt like they could maintain, plus the open land on the properties, so getting it to a density that sort of worked on those properties. Now, you could ratchet it down. Ridge could do that right now. If you eliminate 200, 30% or below, then you're at the right number. Again, I just want to remind everyone, this is a tool and not a plan. And so, so that's a legitimate question, Mike. And if that's something as a matter of policy that council has agita over, that we don't really want to shoot for more units at that level, then you ratchet it down.
So one of my concerns with not, like, preparing for potential growth is, the issues that during the conversation with Carlton Views. We don't know if they are current residents of the city or if they are bringing people into the city who are low income. So that might mean that the projections that we have might be off if we have developments that are using LIHTC that may be on this, included on the spreadsheet, but they are not the current families that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think again, that's exactly right. And I think to follow on Dan's point, the strength of this tool is not in its planning, but it's in its ability to reflect what the plan is. Well, we need more units of this. Our strategy has taught us that, and experience has shown that X percentage of these new LIHTC units that come online are going to come from people who are going to be new city residents, are going to contribute to growth. Therefore, we need to make certain assumptions about having more of those units. Put those in there. What's our real leverage cost? Where do we end up? So this is really to help us calculate the broad picture of what the total overall costs are based on the best available data we have. It's not to drive what we end up doing. And again, it's to be there as we get stronger data and as the strategy develops. And frankly, how we can pace this over time, too.
Maybe it's more helpful to build this chart in
Right.
this context, right? If there weren't any numbers,
Right.
if we didn't have any numbers, then we could just talk about what's feasible,
Yeah.
what the need is, what the priorities are, and you could begin to fill those in. And that's literally, there's no agenda behind the numbers that are shown. It was purely,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're just, and maybe
one-
Ridge, you can put the next one out.
Yeah, just the one other piece that, in future drafts that I think would be great to see would be the county. So if you think about what is, to address some of the questions that Mr. Bellamy brought up and a couple of, that right now we see a lot of time people have left several city commissions to go live in the county because it's cheaper to buy housing there. I think if you look at the fundamentals of cost per square foot, anybody in the real estate industry knows that it drops dramatically, and we are partners with them functionally in a lot of different ways, on including programs with outcomes that have funding sources attached to them. Then you're getting into we did these memorandums with them, which have led to real results in a few areas. Right now, we're not coordinating with them on housing. We could have policy, we could have agreements, we could have programs, we could have funding, we could have, all those things are possible, and you could even have numbers attached to them, and it could fit into a plan starting from where we are right now. But it would require a whole level of additional stuff that we don't have right now. But on the other hand, you grow into regionalism. That was the intent of doing the MOUs. We could grow into cooperative regionalism on housing, specifically because of what's happening already right now, and because of the fluidity of people living here, working there, making a choice, a change one year or another. And I think one of the predicaments that we're in, I know that you're seeing this in metropolitan areas around the country, is once cities become in demand, it creates all these problems for lots of cities around the country. And the city ends up, this wasn't happening 20 years ago, but now it is happening. So you think, and we have an unusual thing in Virginia where we have separate counties and cities. You don't have that anywhere else. So I just think that it would require a whole different level of expertise, or thinking, but maybe the
regional housing partnership is
That's true. I mean, they're
starting from the same place that the city started from a couple of years ago with the gaps analysis.
So could that be put?
There's no reason why that gaps analysis couldn't simply be added to this model.
Okay.
And we
so I
kick
think
that off next week. Yeah.
Regional spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pieces of what we have are already.
And should be a regional.
And it would address, I mean, the scenario, it is a fact that somebody who lives in the county could move into the city as a result of things that we're doing in this plan, and then that is a complexity that I don't know how to deal with that other
We
than.
need to keep the city separate because that is what we fund.
Sure.
So we need to see it separate, we need to see it.
But again, we can build and expand on this at several levels, but there's only, it's several orders of magnitude more complex. But for now, we're saying this is our start with what we know and what the city may be responsible for.
And really quick to Mr. Murphy's point, as well as to what I raised earlier, I do think it's important, and I recognize we really have to focus on the numbers of the affordable units, but also understanding what are the other units that are part of that equation that help it to be affordable and sustainable over the long term. And I think that certainly is a component that will be summarized differently, but we need to recognize and understand.
And that'll show up in the leverage.
Low-income areas, Ms. Hill, I think that we know that today what we produce is about 10% of what gets produced is affordable units, right? And so I've given this little illustration in a couple public meetings, right? Let's say we double that and we're aggressive. I think that means a population growth that puts us upwards of 90,000 people. Ms. Galvin pointed out to me that we have a water supply plan for 70. So I think that we have to think about what does this mean as far as population in the city? What's the impact on infrastructure, schools, all that kind of thing? There are costs besides the sticks and bricks of the housing units. I think the other question, and I don't know whether the HAC or somebody else who can answer this, is if these units are built, what's the land mass that's required to do it? Is that land mass even available within the 10 square miles of the city? Because when you get down to the implementation, there has to be a place to put it.
Rich, could you scroll down a bit? I think that might be helpful at this point, and then maybe expand out one tab. But you'll see that we're looking at 1,211 total new housing units. Of that, we're including things that are sort of multifamily by definition, the SROs, The accessory dwelling units, of course, cost, I mean, just to be,
Well, SRO is definitely not gonna generate, I mean, it depends what you're looking for in multifamily. That's one person per unit, right?
I was referring to the land mass used, and the accessory dwelling units, I mean, those can be, yes, it's a valid point, the question, and some of this is baked into that cake too, but this isn't really a land use tool either. It's about what, it really is driven by cost. The other pieces, land use policy, what we want to prioritize, how they come to bear, then come back to this sheet for cost. It's about dollars, not about a plan to what to build. It's what we think it's going to cost. And we're wrong. And we're going to be more right the more data we get over time. But we think our methodology for starting is a good one.
So Mike, your 90,000 person population is based on an addition of 4,000 affordable units. Is that right?
And assuming that they could be 20% of all units that get built, yeah.
Right. And so what this model told us was that of the new housing interventions, it would be adding about 1,200 units. The rest would be making existing units either safe, decent, or affordable. So if you scroll down, if you don't mind, Ridge.
Right.
So the comparison of the 1,200 new units, keep scrolling, vis-a-vis the 2,300 interventions, which are things like rehabs, emergency repairs, housing counseling, IDA grants that help people move into more vouchers that help the existing housing stock be safe and affordable. So that's one of the things that this projection said, is that the land use catastrophe that we may have imagined is maybe not such a bad, it's maybe not so bad after all. Especially if you keep to that 3-to-1, I think is what you suggested. 4,000 units would be 12,000 market rate units. Now we're looking at 1,200 new units, which would mean 4,000 new units. It's still sizable population growth, but it's under the, I believe it's under the water supply plan. Still.
I'll make one further point of refinement there, if you can scroll back up for a second. Of those 1,200 new housing units, the majority of those actually happens on existing Friendship Court or public housing land that doesn't need any additional site. The only spot in this, the areas that do need new land are affordable home ownership. Accessory dwelling units, theoretically not. Theoretically, they go on existing sites. LIHTC rentals and SRO. So really we're talking about potentially 3 to 4 LIHTC related projects, 2 or 3 probably more likely, plus home ownership. The rest of it goes on existing land that's already parceled for affordable housing because it's already public housing or Friendship Court.
And those can be land efficient, depending on the policies we choose.
Yeah, so that's
You wanna scroll back
550.
down?
That's good.
That represents 20% of the total.
So,
The number comes way down.
go to TBM.
Is affordable home ownership all single family?
Probably a mixture. I mean, we didn't get that far.
We don't know.
The pricing is the pricing is attached. The per unit cost is for attached units, and it includes cost of land acquisition.
Excuse me.
But if a big chunk of those are condos, smaller units, apartments, that unit cost goes down because the land is more. The land acquisition and development is more.
I'm just trying
efficient.
to determine, as we look at this, right, in combination with the housing strategy, in combination with the completion of the comp plan and the land use map, right, it matters what that looks like, right, what your purple areas are, and what the other uses are. And, if these are single family homes and they're tiny little lots, right, they're only 0.2 each, you're still talking about what, 60 acres in the city or something, right? So, I mean,
No,
it's
that's
a
a really good
significant,
point.
you
So-
know, it's a significant amount of acreage that I don't know. I mean, you go look at a map, tell me where the 60 acres are. So
Well, I think
So
this-
we didn't model any, single-family detached homes here at all.
Right.
There's not a single one. The least dense product is attached homes.
But that, these are important. I crunched the numbers, and it's about 74,000 people. If there's 2.3 people per household, when you get 1,200 units. So we're right at that point.
That's including the 4-to-1, the 3-to-1 ratio that.
All I did was take the 1,200 new units that you said, and the rule of thumb is that each unit is 2.3 people.
Mhm.
And you multiply that out, you get about 74,000 people. So then, when you add,
If you
that,
add-
no, that's
but-
27,000 people, and you add it to 47,000,
Right.
we get up to that 74,000 number. Which is 72,000 is, you know, and that number was correlated when they did the numbers with the AECom engineering, they correlated that based on what our existing build-out would be with our existing entitlement structure of zoning. So that's kind of,
These are exactly the right policy.
so this
questions
is,
for all
this
of
is
y'all
really
to
important
think
to
about,
keep
yeah.
that understood.
And part of what we'll have to think about is how many of those 1,200 new housing units would be occupied by people who already live here but are living in unaffordable housing. It doesn't mean 1,200 new people coming to Charlottesville or 1,200 units with 2 times 3 people
Got
in
it,
them.
okay.
That could be 1,200 people who live here now who are
That's
drowning
important to know too.
or can't afford to build wealth because they can't afford to buy a home. Now they can. So, I mean, that's all of this is, you know, we hope to play out in the strategy. This is really just a starting point, and this was, you know, informed judgment. The yellow boxes were stuff that we just put in there, you know, to have a place to start.
Would you give us sort of a start looking at some future?
All right, you want me to open up?
Yep, next.
All right, so then, this is what it looks like when you cost that out over 15 years. By year. So if we were, and you might want to talk about the compression, but this would be if you were building some of these units in phases, this is how much would be needed for each of those phases.
So the point about compression that Rich was just making, so if you scroll down, say for home ownership or other categories underneath, let's just use home ownership for a second. That assumes basically a trickle of home ownership across those 15-year spectrum. Whereas opposed to, for example, these public housing for second or friendship court, we know they're going to happen in discrete phases in a relatively short period of time. So we don't know how many public housing phases yet, or at least I don't know how many public housing phases. So we kind of estimated 4 phases, but that may not be the right number. I don't know. But it's a way of kind of showing that the effect of cost over time as best we understand it at the moment, or as we're modeling it.
And this is gross. It's just linear with an inflation rate in it. There's no magic. We just had our starting point. This is what it would cost over the time period if we just did that in a linear fashion and we put a 5% inflation rate in there. We could change that to whatever we want, and it makes a huge difference. Just to get an idea of what is the nut in these time periods.
Could you give an example of when you all were discussing like the affordable home ownership? What was included in, like, what was a part of that discussion?
So, you mean why is this
So
150 or?
No, who's building those units? Where are they being built at? What type of housing is it? Did y'all have that discussion?
There aren't a whole lot of assumptions here in that regard. We just
Okay.
did our best shot at we assume that we need some affordable home ownership in this spectrum.
So how did you come up with the price and the number?
The price is based on history.
The history of what?
The history of affordable housing that's been built. So much of that came
But
from,
it hasn't really been built, so.
what do you mean hasn't been built?
So,
It hasn't been being built, like, we,
Well, there's the Habitat houses.
so
Yeah,
we're,
we built 20-ish a year, and the average cost is roughly 170,000.
okay, so that's what I'm saying. So if this
Yeah.
discussion came from the work you're doing, then that's what I was asking.
Yeah, there's some other affordable home ownership,
Okay.
like land trust housing that's been built. There's been some others, but Habitat's been the primary builder in that space. Yeah.
The gap applies whether Habitat's building them or.
Okay.
No, but it's kind of where the numbers come from.
Yeah.
I think what your
Yeah.
question is like,
Yeah.
what, there's something went into that, you know, I mean, this was just a multiplication of a cost per square foot times this number of square foot for those, small ADUs. Who knows whether 350 is the right size, but anyway, and then obviously if that changes, the number cost per unit changes.
What I've read, I mean, ADUs, they're like micro units. That's kind of a typical square footage for those accessory dwelling units.
So what's the role of local government funding within ADU versus people in single-family homes choosing to have those on
Excellent
their
strategy
R1
and policy
parcels?
question.
Well, again, before Stacy left, she imparted to me, maybe others, was that what they were working on with the partnership in Portland was looking at how aggressive Portland had been using ADUs as a way to expand affordable housing. And they did that by providing loan assistance to homeowners to build accessory dwelling units, provided that they were then leased to low-income
So this is an
residents.
incentive program.
So it was an incentive program that they also then followed up with assistance managing, because a lot of, folks don't have experience managing.
So in this case, programmed in, again, it's fungible, 15 grand a unit. Let's say the city contributed that in exchange for a 20-year deed restriction or a 30-year deed restriction or something like that. You're basically buying an affordability period out of it.
Can we see the roll-up column to the right?
You sure can. And is there anything you want to look at affordable home? What did you want to look at?
I'll look at any of them, but I mean, if you're on affordable, so what you're saying is the city funding
Right.
should be $21 million for homeowners. Am I reading that?
Yes, you are
correctly?
reading that correctly.
Well, except there's no
Over 15
should.
years.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, if
the city
this is what was
prioritizes.
done, this is what it would cost.
Based on what we know today, to build those 300 over that 15-year period of time, assuming the construction costs go by 5% a year.
For some reason, my ADUs didn't have
So I guess I had one
Mr.
big question, kind of
Sell.
stepping back for a second. One of the challenges we actually discussed the idea of not putting any numbers in here at all, because we knew that we were going to get into the weeds in some of those assumptions or whatever that we just kind of plugged in there. If we step back from a second without looking at those details, is the framework itself useful to City Council as a planning tool? Recognizing that we can change any of those numbers in there to whatever people either feel comfortable with or feel is justified. Is the framework itself a useful
I think the
tool?
tool is definitely helpful. And I only can speak for myself. I wouldn't want us to take this conversation or discussion as if we're being, for me rather, combative. I think it's important for us to just ask these questions in this forum so that we can get to where we need to be. And that may create, I don't know if tension is the right word, but it's just kind of some difficult conversations. But these are discussions and conversations that we have to have in order to move forward. And I think the tool, again, is very helpful, but it's just about how we get the right numbers in. How do we properly forecast and plan? And that's what we hear today. So I don't want you, again, your comments, or hear our comments as if we're just like, no, this is horrible, we hate it. Because I don't. It's just necessary, though.
Yeah, I think that for me, in the next cut, the things that would help add a level of realism. I get, and I mean that in a good way, in terms of translating numbers and adding qualitative onto the quantitative that you have taken the risk of doing here, is the implementation of this at the administrative level, setting aside some of the, is the question. It's such a big element of this, is like, so if we're gonna go, we got a report last week where we created 46 new sport affordable units last year in 2018. The year before was 31. So if you're talking about expanding that by multiples of 10 or 20, which is kind of mind-boggling in a city of 50,000 people, right? But dreaming big, thinking about it at the government level, it will depend a lot on execution and staff and programs and implementation, and that's what. So if there could be narrative in here which would talk about, because one of those areas is different from the other. One, figure of 75 here is not, the 75 under Friendship Court is totally different because of the level of infrastructure and staff that you guys have and establishment than the 75 under affordable homeowners, like totally different. And the numbers are different on each of them because you have to have programs and staff and implementation. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that those are a whole different level. Right now we had one full-time staff person dedicated to this whole area. I know that in Arlington County, Portland is many multiples the size of us as a city. So the paperwork that goes into doing an affordable dwelling unit, you have to implement that so that there's not a huge amount of paperwork. So you don't need to open up a file on each application where you have to do 18 rounds of permissions or whatever. So you want to think about that so you can actually get it going. But I think that thinking about how much we have to fund and program on annual budgets toward the operational administrative side of getting each one of these things up and running will add a level of.
Staff is going to be required to manage this.
Yeah.
City staff.
Yes. I think that's a simple, and I think that will add a level of realism to this, to guesstimate at that and look at like-sized cities, use whatever models we can to translate this into implementation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be helpful for us to understand all the tools that potentially are available, and I guess that's really what Mike's working on maybe, but I mean, it's not necessarily something that goes in CIP. It could be tax relief for somebody who's doing an
That's what
affordable
you
dwelling
guys
unit,
work
or,
on. This housing strategy.
well, but just in terms of what the physical tools are that are available to the city, it's not our area of expertise. So we don't control CIP or what forms of tax relief are available for, what forms of regulatory relief are available, feasible to help address
And I'm not
cost.
mistaken though, but that's what this comprehensive affordable housing strategy is supposed to be doing
Yes,
for us.
yeah, I'm
Because
just
we
saying
don't
that.
even know what we don't have yet,
Right.
or what's possible. So we've taken shots at that, but I just want to make it clear that that's part of what
What we're trying
you
to
all are
figure out.
trying to do.
Yes.
And if we need, as Mr. Murphy pointed out, we're going to have conversations later on to see whether we need to join forces with the comprehensive plan update and do this more
Well,
comprehensively
and I
with
think
the outside assistance.
For the purposes of this tool, what that really boils down to is what is the city's, how does that affect the city's leveraged cost to do it? Because this is really driven by calculating dollars in. So what that really does, what's the impact on cost of what the city and the leverage? And I think that's one of the key pieces of this is the assumptions that we are making, which we know are in some cases quite accurate as of today, present day, but as one, strategy develops, two, we get more data, the leveraging cost is $1 per unit. Relatively small changes in that make relatively large changes in overall costs and overall numbers, and Ridge might be able to plug in an example of that. If we can move the leverage of just a few in one given category, what it does to some of our totals. And I'm not sure what an example of that might be, but.
So let's take the ADUs, because we're on them.
All right.
So we'll see the ADUs, it's, $2.3 million if we assume that we have to give a $15,000 leverage to each, and they're in those bands, but you see the price is the same each way. So let's say it doesn't need to be $15,000, it only needs to be $5,000.
Okay, good.
So it was, what did we say, 2.3 million? And I'm sorry, I can't
Yeah.
have those on the
Yeah.
same screen at the same time. We went down to $788,000 to produce those units.
And see, I see this as extremely useful, once you get. You can
Once
plug
we
and
know what
play.
we
And so it would be informed by how much do we want to spend to generate those units and what do they give us in what bands? Is it realistic? I mean, so you'd have some policy questions. If we give an incentive for an ADU, should we focus that on the less than 30% AMI and say that's, if we were going to give you a loan or help you build this ADU, you got to give us an agreement that says we're going to only rent for people under 30% AMI. And you're like, maybe that's a lot cheaper way of producing those units than maybe if we were to buy, build units for that same cohort of people.
Mr. Can I ask Mr. Murphy, like,
Sure.
what do you think about that? I mean, in regards to
So
what
I certainly
Mr. Sherman-
understand how the tool works, but in this case, if the rate on the ADU is fixed, it has to have the same escalator, right? So
Mhm.
it's 5,000 in year one, but it's what in year 15?
So I did the escalator by number of units, so it's a little bit hard to break down. I mean, I can do that,
We'll
but
just do it by plugging in number of units to 1, and then you can see it.
here,
Yeah,
Yeah.
just hit 1.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
so why is that doing that?
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure this
I
is.
mean,
Because you're spending 15 years building one unit.
Oh, you're right.
That's
Make it
right.
15.
That's right.
Make it 15. Good
Yeah.
point. Thanks, Brandon.
Right. There you go.
Ah,
That's what I'm
yeah.
looking for.
And I mean, I think even in this model, there's a huge emphasis on addressing the need of those from the 30 to 50% AMI, and then even if you look at the summary, if you look on the summary really quickly, so 87% of the distribution of housing are for those 60% and below AMI. That will make a major impact within our community. So again, like I think the tool as it's currently constructed, it works. It's just about us getting down to the specifics and working through that portion.
But then it also helps us over 15 years identify just how much we're gonna have to float by way of bonds.
Right.
Additionally,
Or additional resources, yeah.
Additional
Additional
resources.
Yeah.
And so if you can you scroll all the way down, go to the other sheet, scroll all the way down.
Go to,
Like worksheet?
15-year
Oh,
compressed,
compressed,
because it
okay.
gives you a summary of, this is to Kathy's point.
Yeah, how much it's really gonna cost.
Yeah, so what this shows, again, all of this can be changed based on how much leverage you want to demand,
Yeah.
what AMI you want to meet, what you want to invest in. But this particular model to get to 4,000 interventions is over 15 years is 157 million that leverages 3 times that.
Right.
And so the total building cost is about $500 million, of which 150. But again, that's not the decision for policy wonks like us.
Yeah.
That's the decision for council. Those are decisions for council to make. You're the elected
But
representative.
this is a building your way out of it tool, right?
Right.
As opposed to we have reports to the council from previous consultants that say, look, if you don't build at the other price points so that people move to where they ought to be based on their income, you're not freeing up. That's part of your affordability crisis. It also doesn't deal with the potential for policy making with UVA, right? I will maintain, like, the single greatest thing that could happen for us in the world of affordable housing is UVA shifting their policy so that they make kids live on grounds 2 years instead of 1, right? I mean, that would change everything. So there are some outside factors that would change these numbers radically.
Absolutely.
yep.
So,
And then,
Mr. Murphy's point.
I'm sorry.
Well, no, sorry, Rich, excuse me, Mr. Shaw. One thing, like to Mr. Murphy's point, like I don't think it has to be an either or. We can work on this issue in a variety of different ways. So what is that hardline conversation like with President Ryan and those on the Board of Visitors about changing their policy? If they truly want to move in an equitable sense, can your policy be changed, or can you be a major factor in regards to significantly helping us with this dollar amount that's needed. And even to the point that Dan was making in regards to this may cost us 150 some odd $1 million. Like, I was just looking at a model, and Mayor Walker and I were looking at this about in Charlotte. They had a $50 million bond initiative. It went through a referendum, and the public voted on it and whatnot. But there are ways to make this happen. Like this number, I think when sometimes people hear on the surface, like, what in the hell, $157 million? And yeah, it may sound crazy, but there's ways for us to, A, not only get to a portion of that number, but B, we may not need as much as we think if we can work on changing policies or bring in different partners, bring in foundations. Like the Kellogg Foundation is very fond of Charlottesville. There's a litany of different places who want to come in and do the work. So let's put our collective brains together to do it, because now we have this, and not saying this is the end all be all, but this is to a certain extent a guide in terms of a resource perspective of what we need and where we need to go. So now let's execute.
And I want us to be careful with the thought process that if we build for higher incomes, that will free up for individuals at the lower income levels. I mean, we don't have a community that shows for that to be true or possible.
Yeah, I think that was one study, and that's what that study concluded.
I think the study, for those that aren't familiar with it, it was the RCLCO study, right? And that they did, and this is something that Bill Lucy identified way back when, he passed away a few years ago, but the idea being that there are a lot of people that own their homes outright in parts of our city, and so that technically makes them having the best housing deal in the city because they pay no mortgage. And yet they would like to move and stay in the city, but they can't find a place to move into once their children leave. So the idea that they identified in the 2015 study that there was a stock of housing, that if people could downsize and leave their single-family detached homes, that would free up those units for other people that currently don't have access to that kind of housing stock.
But I think in the climate that we have,
Yeah, but would it be affordable to the low and extremely low people? Because even if they move out of it, they may not be making having enough income to be able to rent and to do the electricity and to do the gas or whatever it is. So it still may not be affordable. I would see more of somebody of a higher or middle income moving in those, which still leave that class of people in the same space where they are.
That's a very good point. Like, because you still won't be able to afford.
Because the income is not going up.
But there was, that is a policy question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know in
Think about it like that.
Iowa City, the University of Iowa, partnered with Habitat and the local building industry, and worked with the university so that when they did finally build student housing on grounds and the students left those units, the university immediately went and basically bought those houses, and then working with the local nonprofits, rehab them, turn them back into affordable house, into single-family homes, and then sold them using employer down payment assistance plans to their lower wealth employees. And that's a valid program.
So I would want to point out to this conversation is that was one of the intents of creating a whole ladder of housing opportunities that are supported. So this is not, none of this is about interventions that help people that don't need support. So this is everything from homeless services through affordable home ownership, everything from 0 to 60. It's not talking necessarily.
Yeah, but I think just the point that was brought up about, if you create market rate units, that somehow that will, and I had a conversation recently with a newly retired live in the 1100 block of Druid who was fearful of them even being able to maintain that home they own outright after seeing a house on 6th Street upstairs rent for, I think it's at 2,300 now, in the basement rent for 1,800. That's what is currently on the market. And I drive past that every day. It's right, you know, before I turn my corner. And I'm thinking that's not what that, I've been in that house, that's not what the cost of that house, but someone has purchased it and that's what they have it listed, you know, for rental. So, I mean, I think when we have these conversations, we just need to make sure that we are being, you know, realistic about the climate that has been created over the decades that affordable housing has been ignored.
I think it reinforces this need for regional approach because the city's constrained in terms of land. And so the point you make accurately is lack of supply is driving up market demand, which is driving up prices of everything that's not restricted. And so it creates this bell where you've got low and everything else keeps moving higher.
Yeah, it's true.
And
So I wanted to sort of circle back to something Mr. Murphy said earlier and actually tie it into something that Dr. Bellamy made the point about, that to use the tool as sort of a larger overarching costing and monitor, well, sort of something developed for cost, and it's about cost, not a driver of policy. So to your point about, well, it would be of great benefit if we could convince the university to keep their first and second years on grounds. What are the consequences to that, to cost? What does that do to our leveraging cost? What does that do to that district around the university? And then go back into that, what does that save the city? How does that advance? And how does that affect this? I mean, this is all about, again, we gave some thought to put any dollars in this at all, but this is about what the results of policy are on the one hand, and also to inform policy. Well, we think leverage cost is this. If leverage cost is lower on this category, we can do more or less there. If we make that assumption, what happens to everything else if we've got a finite bucket of dollars that we can pull from every source? And how that all interacts with each other. It's not meant to sort of drive or make any determinations, it's just to illuminate.
Well, and just to kind of say why I like this, like Wes and Mike did, or supplement it. The idea being is that you can begin to anticipate, you know, how much capital you're going to need, and instead of being hit with it almost in a reactionary mode, you can just spread this out over 15 years. And you begin, and then the other thing was to realize that no, that was an eye-opener for me, that no, it's not 4,000 new units. We're talking 1,200 new units. It's still a big number, and we still need to find the land capacity. We're going to be looking at an introductory Cherry Avenue plan, which begins to identify underutilized land resources, which we're going to have to repurpose to get those new units somewhere.
But I think to your point, Kathy, so, and this may not be a politically correct statement, or it may not be the most well-liked statement, but for me, it's really difficult for us to move forward, have these discussions, for us to rack our brains in terms of what we need to do without having UVA at the table, here at this table, and then us calling them on the carpet in regards to what are you going to do in order to help us address these issues. Like, I know we have the, what's it called, the PAC?
Yes.
We have the PAC, and for those, not a political action committee, before I get in trouble, it's a
Planning and Advisory Committee.
Planning and Advisory Committee, thank you. Let me be very clear here, there's a lot of tweeting going on. So we have the Planning Advisory Committee, and then, you know, from time to time, we have these regional meetings, or city and county meetings, where we talk about these great things. And Mr. Signer, when he was mayor, he did a great job of trying to pull both jurisdictions together. And I don't think we have issues. There's no beef per se, but we, like, it's really difficult for us to do this work in a silo.
Exactly.
Like, they have to come to the table and be willing to assist us in this. Like, in my opinion, we shouldn't have another HAC council meeting without having reps from UVA there. Like, we shouldn't continue to have these discussions without us clearly asking them, this is what we want. You need to let us know what you can do, what you're willing to do, and then we need to look at how do we bargain and negotiate the services that we provide to them, because they utilize a lot of our services. They benefit a great deal from them being here.
Pilot, payment in lieu of taxes.
I mean, yeah, like we have to figure out what we are going to get back from them, because it is ridiculous in a city in which they do so much, quote unquote, for us, that they rarely, if ever, put in on these kind of discussions or monetary kind of assets that they have. The school has a $80 billion endowment or
And
something
this is
crazy?
one of the key points of their new working group that they're putting out for President Ryan, right? The working group that they put together. So, I mean,
President Ryan should be at this meeting.
Well, Ridge is here.
Yeah, I mean that's great.
He's on the working group.
I appreciate that. No, but I mean,
That doesn't mean anything though.
no. Yeah. I mean, no, and I think we all have the utmost respect for
He's the
Ridge.
lead.
But how do we know that UVA is serious until they start bringing their reps
those
here?
conversations with them, but this conversation is just shifting. Right, I think it's the first priority on their survey, right, that the working group came up with, who has people on it like Denise Johnson and Harold Foley, who are helping to, discuss hopefully what they've been hearing at, in meetings.
But I'm tired of us talking and having working groups. Like, I want them to show us their commitment by having their rector, their VP, their president
I don't
here.
know what he's gonna do.
Yeah,
I hate to, I don't want to defend anybody. I'm just saying, I think the first step is somebody new is here, and let's see what they're gonna do. And if they just created this working group and then nothing happens with it, I think this is the time for us to have all these conversations.
Ms. Joy, can I say one more thing?
And I think
Can I
that
say
they
one
may
thing?
be, and having the conversations,
I'm
just
cool
making
with
sure.
that. If we know this number cost us, and hypothetically, can you scroll
And I
down?
want us to be careful throwing out numbers. These are examples.
This is just
This
example.
is what we're saying is.
If the example then, quote unquote, is $157,101,337, just as the example.
Plus or minus.
Example, plus or minus, that's the example.
27 cents.
27 cents, thank you, Kathy. If that's the example, can we go to UVA and say, this is the example of what we think this may cost us? Can you all provide us over 15 years? Will you all be willing to commit to $50 million over the next 15 years to help us get to where we need to be? Let us know, yes or no now. And if you say no, then we need to think about what services we're going to cut back on. Because if you can't help us, thank you for putting the point through, whoever put that in there. Thank you. Because if you can't, then to me, a lot of the conversations that we're having, it just puts the onus on us. And they use West Main Street, in which we're having to do over. They're taking up a great deal of the housing, which is in turn bringing up a great deal of housing shortages. I'm not even going to all the stuff that UVA does, and I like UVA. I don't have any issues with them, but you need to pay your share, and I don't think that they've been doing so. They've been giving us crumbs. We need to ask for the steak, the potatoes, the carrot cake, and then the tea or water afterwards.
But part of that discussion for us is to make sure, like last year when water rates came up, we gave them a pretty, 84, we gave them a 3-year time frame to start paying 100%.
You're right.
Those are the times that we need to make sure that if you're saying you have the money, then it's simple, not simple, that amount is significant, but it's times like that we need to make sure that we say, okay, so this is not phased in over 3 years, too.
You're right.
And that was, kudos to staff for working that through.
Oh, no,
was a major
that's-
correction.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying,
Yeah.
I'm just making the same comments I made then. That it's just important for us to, you know, have these conversations, and I'm having these conversations when I meet with people, at UVA.
And again, the county is also a partner in this as well. And I would just say that, you know, you said, Dr. Bellamy, it would be difficult for us to get there. I think it's near impossible looking, you know, if these are if I'm just like hypothetically, if this is the example we're going from, when I've seen these years out and what those numbers are, I don't know that a city of our size with our size of a budget really could sustain this over this 15 years without that partnership and that support, given those numbers and knowing the other priorities that will continue to be knocking on the door.
But I also want us to not, I know we have to think about things in a regional, with the regional approach, and you're about to sit on that regional housing, what is it, committee or partnership. But we have to, we can't force anyone else to do anything. So we need to make sure that we just get our house in order, and that we make, we can make a commitment to, you know, have these conversations, but we also need to make a commitment to do our best, no matter what they decide to do, and not make things contingent upon.
No,
you know,
I
what
agree
they-
with you there, but we can make, like, so you're right. We can't force per se anyone to do anything, and yes, we need to get our house in order. But UVA uses a whole lot of city resources, so there's leverage there.
I'm just,
So to bring us back to the funding tool.
but this is not just, I just want to make one more point. So UVA did not just do whatever they want without being allowed to do it
That's
over the
right.
years.
That's
So that was a partnership there to create the conditions that we have. And the city has to take the majority of responsibility for that, because they allowed it, you know, the city allowed it to happen, so.
I
So
just,
we-
I
Go ahead.
just, what I wanted to chime in to say to you, Wes, is that I don't think it's Ryan that who needs to be in the room, because he has a boss. Bosses. I think the board of visitors need to have a commitment also, because he works for someone. We have this conversation, I had this conversation with him about providing housing even for the people who work at UVA, you know, workforce housing. And so, but he's a nice guy, and he wants to meet everybody, and, you know, I don't have a whole lot of trust in the whole equity thing that's going on, because at the end of the day, it's the board of visitors who he listens to. And so somehow there has to be a strategy where the board of visitor, you know, is focusing on that or having a commitment. I just don't think, I think you're right that the city needs to really commit to and be serious about providing affordable housing for everyone, not just the 60% of the AMI. And I just want to say, David Ellis, who used to work here, who's now, you know, in Raleigh, had to tackle this issue, and what he did was to get a consultant, a different eye, to come in and look at it and basically say, here's what's needed, here's what you need to do. And the city council approved what the plan was, and he was able to put a lot of money into affordable housing. And I think that's something, that's a model. We need to reach out to him, and you know, he was one of y'all folks, and y'all let him go, but
You let him go.
well, he left. He left. Well, he left. But anyway, he left. But anyway, I'm just saying, at least there is a model. I mean, there is a model of, you know, how do you seriously address the affordable issue?
You talked about strategy, which I think is incredibly important. If Governor Northam has stated that affordable housing is one of his top priorities, and he's had this big meeting about it and so forth, the governor and the Secretary of the Commonwealth appoints the individuals to the Board of Visitors. Then we need to be very clear with Governor Northam and let him know there needs not be individuals being reappointed or new people being appointed who do not believe in equity, as everyone around the state has been saying, nor if they don't believe that UVA should be putting in some kind of resources to assist us. Like, those are discussions that we can have with him directly, we can have with the Board of Visitors Chair directly, we can have with President Ryan directly, but they have to begin happening in these kind of settings, not in our silos, but in public for everyone to see. And I would love to hear how they respond to our questions.
Okay, so we
what
have
next step
15,
here?
just,
We need to figure out where we're going from
Yeah.
here. Yeah.
so is there something, I know we didn't get very far, I guess, into the presentation, so just how do you all want to spend the next 15 minutes or so?
So I-
And we still have to have time for public comment.
No, I appreciate you asking. I was about to ask if we could refocus a little bit. I think we've gotten, here's what I think I've heard. So I'd like to sort of state it and see if we've heard it right. There seems to be general consensus that this is a good starting point for a model, but there's some additional information that needs to be on it, such as what's it going to take to implement this, if that can be added to the model. The other thing too is that when the county and the surrounding counties in the region do their own form of gaps analysis, that plugging that into here and seeing what the totality would be like would be really helpful. So did I hear those things right? Am I off base on that?
And if we could build the spreadsheet to include policy decisions like SUP requirements as another way of meeting the goal and what that does to the numbers so that council can see the benefits of doing that and what it saves in terms of money from the city in terms of its investment.
And something very basic and simple, I thought it would be simple, but just knowing year to year how our numbers are going up relative to the total numbers of units, so we get that percentage in our heads. That's been the hardest thing to get tracked from year to year, is really where we are in the build out of the affordable units and what kind. And this is really getting at the variety of units that we need, or interventions that we need.
Can we show that, Rich?
But-
We show unit by unit, year by year, right?
So you're showing how you're building out
But
that
no,
total
it's just
year
price.
by year? That's just price.
Just,
It'd be
all we
great
have is money.
if that you could get a column that shows the
Right.
units that are being built every year in those categories.
Yeah, and this is kind of just flat linear, so we
And then
can do a lot
might
more refinement on
realize
that.
in the process that we are not getting the right bang for the buck by focusing on one of these interventions, when we could get more units if we were shifting our investment. And that is where this becomes a strategic tool.
So by checking in as the tool continues to be built out, the idea of a holistic housing ladder from homelessness through other forms of affordability, that makes sense to counselors?
It does to me.
And
It's the spectrum.
I mean, again, this is, from the HAC's perspective, this is helping to guide our thinking as we develop a strategy. And hopefully at the end of the day, whenever that is done, we'll present a strategy where those strategic items are then put in this, once we have more information and it fleshes this out, so that the strategy and this tool are the same, are in sync.
I think there's a lot of value in running sort of hypothetical what-if scenarios. And you can run lots of those, right?
Right.
Figure out what if we did this or did that. I would caution us against building something that involves too many assumptions that are too far out, because I think the reliability of the model will,
Deteriorate.
deteriorate quickly.
Again, I think one of the key pieces of this is that the variables that we have stuck in here are very variable now. And the idea is, as we develop a strategy, if at least a couple of them get less so, the numbers get a lot tighter. And then we can start moving numbers around to more scenarios that have a realistic outcome.
And
So
for
that-
an example, so as CRHA's plans develop and the phasing plan becomes more concrete, so Crescent Halls is costed out now, South First Street will be soon, they'll decide on a third phase and a fourth phase. As they start to do architecture and engineering and start to get bids, we'll be able to actually plug numbers into that. And so the model will become, as you move through time, we'll move closer to the far out assumptions, but we'll also start baking in the real numbers. And this gives us a place, so when CRHA, I think this will be helpful for the Housing Authority for when they start to come up with, with things that have more real numbers on them, you can plug them in. And so this gives the city guidance about when they need to bond, for example, or when they need to reserve money for. So I think this could be really helpful that way, and get more concrete as we move right.
So we've addressed two of the three questions on the memo. On the back, on the bottom is outcomes of the joint work session, the outcome goals. One question is whether the tool is useful in its current form, and I think we've heard feedback in general that it's useful in concept. There's still some refinement that needs to happen. Another question was whether additional information input is necessary. We've identified a few additional columns and pieces of information in there. But the other question we have not really talked about is whether the interventions that we list is the right list. Are there other interventions that you feel like, other interventions we should take off the list first is one question. Then secondarily, are there other interventions that people can think of that aren't represented there? And that doesn't necessarily have to be answered now. I know that you're just looking at this for the first time, but it's sort of an open question. If there are other things that you think should be added into this for us to consider.
But won't that be a product of the development of the housing strategy?
Absolutely. But if there are things now that you can think of that we want to have on here to make this tool more useful, please say so.
I would like for there to be a focus on implementation and staffing, and really thinking with sophistication about what would the Cadillac version of a staff plan look like that could actually translate some of this, given what we know about is it an office with 15 people in it? Just dream big. Like, think about this is a lot of work here, but people working on this full-time with benefits who are actually doing this stuff. I think it'd be very helpful.
But
to think
Is
of.
the city staff you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and I also.
I mean think about. I mean, it's a lot of. But I think that otherwise this just becomes on paper. I mean, it needs to be implemented. So let's think that through. I mean,
So-
you're talking, that would be really difficult to do in a model like this.
I think it would be a little hard. I think that's a separate parallel track. So we need to know how this is going to get implemented.
But I think
But I don't know how you build
possibly
that in
one way
spreadsheet.
we could approach that is to look at precedent in other cities based on scale and based on goals in terms of the amount of housing that they're looking at building.
Yeah,
How much staff do they have in place to try to facilitate that plan?
it's not a foreign concept, and I think we would be there are a lot of people. I mean, I'm not trying to just harp on UVA, but like, is it possible for us to
really?
No, but seriously, can we? I mean, we have one of the leading institutions in the nation in our backyard. Is it possible for them to help us with some of this work? I mean, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel or put it all on ourselves when there's people who are more than willing to help us.
Okay.
And really quick, what I heard also though from different angles is just we have to understand what it is the maintenance costs associated with these things if we're building in year one over the course of 15 years. And what is that comprehensive approach that makes these things sustainable? Because those are the questions that we're going to continue to ask as we get asked for impactful funding. Is like, how are you going to make this sustainable? And so that we're not finding ourselves just in the same patterns that we've been historically. And so I think that's important for us to kind of have a comprehensive look at this.
All right, so
I think on timing,
we
that
need
we're-
to
yeah,
open
we
up.
need to, yes, ma'am, I think, so,
So can we open it up for public comment, please?
Mayor, while somebody's walking up,
Uh-huh.
I just say,
You
to,
can
in
come
response
up if you'd
to
like
Sunshine's,
To the mic.
this,
No,
this,
not you.
that might, okay, you know. So, it'd be great for the HAC to talk with staff a little bit more, particularly about this section on additional housing interventions, right? You know, I think there's some things missing there that are the soft supports and peer interventions, and I have some questions about why government is the, you know, logical funder of like the IDA or the housing hub. You know, I mean, there's things to unpack in this list more than the housing stock.
And even for me, the affordable home ownership is another one to look at to make sure that we are exploring what more traditional home ownership options are too. Okay, so we're now open for public comments. Is there anyone who would like to speak?
Oh, cool.
Please to approach the mic. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brandon Collins. I work for FAR. I love this tool. I was happy to see it come into being. I deeply encouraged Grant and Sunshine and Dan and others to lock themselves in a room and talk about what their capacity is, what their land is, what their resources are to try to meet this goal that you see in the gap. And I think they've done a really good job. It's not 100% accurate, but it's based on some pretty good assumptions. Otherwise, Dan would have come out and said, we'll build 1,000 new home ownership for everybody. But, you know, obviously you can't do that, right? So the assumptions that are in there are, yeah, they're not exact, but they're pretty good ballpark about what people can do. Housing Authority, you know, for example, when you look at Housing Authority, they don't have any land costs, so that's baked into the number that they look at. And so I think when you look at this tool, and as you're developing it, you know, I think this is going to be a really important thing that the council adopt, that the city adopt long-term as a tool to evaluate, to move forward and help build the strategy as well as evaluate the strategy and figure out how to fund it. But I think you can say with a pretty straight face, $150 million investment to get $500 million worth of affordable housing in the city of Charlottesville and finally meet this commitment that the city has never made to the people who live here. That's a pretty good deal for y'all, and I really hope that's something that that y'all can take to heart, notwithstanding UVA, notwithstanding other partners, notwithstanding policy decisions, right? Notwithstanding, yes, we need wages to rise. Yes, there's the Dillon rule, and that's a problem. We can't worry about that when we sit down to dig in on what the investment from the city for the people of the city is going to be. We have to look at housing, affordable housing for people, for families. We're looking at individual families, individual people, and individual connections, and I think this tool really provides that. So I really want you to adopt that and stick to it close. I think we all can probably support that as a tool, and it's great because you can plug in numbers. I'm a little disappointed in some of the conversations I heard tonight. As Dr. Bellamy said, it's cool because you got to get some of this out there, right? But I don't think there's any sinister behavior on the part of the HAC. And I think the city is asking important questions, right? Because it's your responsibility to take care of the money and take care of the taxpayers. But the HAC's not trying to pull the wool over the city's eyes. The HAC is a group of really committed people who really understand policy. They understand numbers. They've been spending a lot of time on this. You know, they're undergoing redevelopment. They've got redevelopment going on. Grant's got redevelopment going on. And people are putting in this huge effort on top of that to meet this intense need that the city has. And I really hope the city of Charlottesville will grant the HAC a lot of leeway in coming up with policy ideas and kind of give them the respect and kind of let them take the charge, because we do need this Marshall Plan, and I think the people to make that Marshall Plan happen is the HAC in partnership with housing providers.
Hi, Walt Heineck, I'm a citizen. Before we got in the weeds a lot today, and I just wanted to kind of pull back for a second. 2017 happened here, right? And it was like a huge X-ray on this community. We saw not for the first time, we saw in depth the level of the problem that we have with institutional racism in our zoning, in our housing policy, and it happened. And now the rest of the country is looking for us. A bunch of folks from around the country are looking to us to see how we solve these problems. So the eyes are all on right now. So I really appreciate what the HAC has done here today, because I think it's a really excellent example of what we call in the policy world backward mapping, to start with the road to 4,000 and move back to see how we get there. And I think it's a really excellent start to move in that direction, and I applaud them for doing that. I think what the public's now looking to from council is a commitment to a holistic strategy for over 15 years. That's what we want out of council. We want a commitment to solve this problem, not in a piecemeal way, because if we start getting into the weeds about all the ways that this can't happen, we're going to go back to that piecemeal year-by-year approach, and we're never going to get to 4,000 interventions. So this holistic approach, I think, is really, really a solid way of thinking about moving forward. I think moving forward with this model with data is actually the way to make decisions, and I think this is a really good place, a good starting point for data-driven decision making, and I think that we're onto something here. The next step, and I think what the public's looking for, is for you to translate this into the housing strategy and then into the comp plan so that it becomes a guide for council over a longer term. So we don't fall back into the bad habits of doing things for a couple of years, forgetting about it, and then moving on. So moving as quickly as, and you know, from my point of view, the plane has crashed into the building. The longer that we wait, the harder this gets to do. It gets harder and harder for us to do this. Available land for what we need to do here is being sold off every day. So the longer you wait and the longer we dilly-dally about this, the harder it's going to become to do. So I think this is the road to 4,000 interventions, units or interventions or however you want to do it. And I think it ought to be done by any means necessary. That means if you have to raise a bond for $50 million, get on it. Let's get started. If you have to raise my taxes in a progressive way that doesn't impact folks that make less money than me in this town, do it. Let's start doing that right now. Go back to $1.11. If that's what it takes. A lot of what I heard today is we're waiting for the cavalry to come over the hill. The feds are not coming over the hill anymore. The county probably is not coming over the hill, and I guarantee you UVA is going to tell you we contribute to the economy in a significant way already. So there's your answer. And I've already heard that answer for them recently, right? So let's not wait for the cavalry to come over the hill. We have the resources, we have the means, there's a way to do this. So I'm hoping that we can start thinking about what we can do within the city limits right now. I'd love to see council figure out a way to give CRHA some more funds for capacity building so that they can do pre-planning and maybe even start looking into starting a CDC at a CRHA. I think this question of prioritizing by AMI is really important. I know that I heard today that that this plan is balanced, and I think it is balanced. I think there are pathways to ownership here. But if we have to make tough decisions, you've seen it laid out by AMI. And let's start prioritizing by 30% AMI. If that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. So the last thing I think to get this done, I think you're going to need a staff that's committed to this priority and to your vision. So let's get some commitment all the way down the ladder from council to HAC to the staff. And I think we can do this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just want to reiterate what other people have said. I think this is a really exciting tool and a really exciting conversation because we're starting to think about a comprehensive strategy for funding affordable housing, which we need in conjunction with a comprehensive strategy for affordable housing. Otherwise, we have a strategy with no teeth. And there are cities that have spent tens of millions of dollars on affordable housing, and it ended up making no long-term impact because they weren't thinking strategically and long-term about the strategy and the funding sources. So this is obviously just a draft. This is just a beginning, but I hope that the city does not give up in thinking in this way because we need to be thinking on a 10, 15-year time horizon, because if that number of $150 million is anywhere near accurate, we are only funding 30% of what we know we need. So, you know, if we're looking at this 15 years, it sounds like a lot of money, but it's only about $10 million a year, which is not only 10 million, but that's feasible, that's doable, if we're thinking strategically and long-term. So I just hope we can continue this. And one last thing, sort of separate from this conversation, but the Planning Commission recently voted to add $1 million to the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund, which I think should be celebrated and is a great move. But I would actually encourage council to consider making that $1.5 million because the housing fund is where you have a little bit more leeway, and if things come up that you weren't predicting and weren't expecting, that's where you can have more flexibility to fund those initiatives, and I'm sure that those kind of things are going to pop up. So I don't think we should forget about that. But that's it, and again, excited. Hope we can continue this.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Just as a point of clarification, Just as a point of clarification to Mr. Heineke, I agree with what you said, but just to be sure, the Housing Authority does have a CDC. We actually adopted that, 2 months ago. So just so everyone knows, like, we've done that.
All right, and just in the short term, I know that there's some discussions ongoing in preparation for our next council meeting in terms of looking at I know that one of the speakers brought up just this whole step function of getting to where we are now to a housing strategy, to a comprehensive plan. And I know that we're looking for some alignment from multiple stakeholder groups on what that support looks like. And so I know there's some discussions happening tomorrow, and just want to get whatever feedback to Mr. Murphy and staff so that when we have that conversation on Tuesday, that we're all coming at the same page. So I think a few of you are involved in that and appreciate that. We have a council meeting on Tuesday.
Yeah,
It's a
gotcha.
holiday.
So this is the idea of talking about whether or not the needs to assist the comp plan and the needs to assist the housing strategy are now
Streamline. Yeah.
coming together. Your timelines have collided. And so
Now
what
what?
resources can we now bring to bear that would help both of the efforts at the same time? And so that's what that's gonna be all about. And it's gonna have that conversation Monday night, too.
Tuesday, yeah.
Tuesday night, oh, sorry, Tuesday night.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.